chill of autumn, 1891, the small industrial town of Millerville, Pennsylvania, became the setting for a discovery so grotesque that the authorities sealed every official record within hours, keeping them hidden from the public for more than 3 decades. In the damp, rotting basement of the abandoned Millerville Opera House, local officials found 17 people chained in darkness. Their bodies showed clear signs of long-term captivity, malnourished, scarred, and broken, in ways no human should endure. But what froze the blood of every witness wasn't just their condition, it was their identities. Every single one of those 17 souls had been officially declared dead, some for months, others for years, across 3 different Pennsylvania counties. Death certificates, funerals, and graves that now stood empty. The man behind this nightmare was Cornelius Vaneir, a charismatic showman who had, for over a decade, toured the country with what seemed to be a legitimate traveling circus. Beneath the bright tents, laughing children, and marveling crowds, however, lurked one of the most depraved schemes of exploitation in American history. The town's newspaper was forbidden from printing the full truth. Witnesses were threatened into silence by corrupt officialsmen who had taken their share of the profits from Vaneir's horrors for years. Before we continue with the disturbing tale of Cornelius Vaneir and his infamous Cabinet of Wonders, I have one request. If stories like this fascinate you as much as they do me, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest forgotten mysteries. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or state in the comments below. The secret of Millerville's tragedy didn't unravel through police skill or detective work. It came to light because of a single act of desperate courage from someone who had lived a nightmare themselves. In 1891, Millerville stood at a crossroads between old-world simplicity and industrial might. Rolling farmlands and tight-knit German immigrant communities were giving way to coal mines and steel foundries. The brand-new branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad had brought both prosperity and ruin. Some saw riches, others only hardship. Its 8,000 residents were a mix of Irish, German, and Eastern European immigrants, drawn by promises of steady work, but often met with brutal conditions. It was a place where people didn't ask questions about a man's past, so long as he worked hard and paid his debts. That willful blindness would become the perfect cover for Cornelius Vaneir's monstrous business. Tall, sharply dressed, and commanding in presence, Vaneir claimed to be the heir of a wealthy Dutch family from New York, a story no one ever bothered to verify. His money was real enough, and he spent it freely in local shops and taverns. In 1887, he purchased the aging Millerville Opera House, claiming it would serve as the winter headquarters for his traveling show, Vaneir's Cabinet of Wonders. Outwardly, the Cabinet of Wonders was everything a late 19th century circus moose acrobats, trained animals, musicians, and a freak show that fascinated paying crowds. But Vaneir's troupe was different. There was Eliza, the bone serpent woman, whose body seemed to bend in ways that defied human anatomy. There was Johann, the Bavarian colossus, a towering 8-foot giant who could bend iron with his bare hands. And most haunting of all, Mary Catherine, the singing angel, a young woman with a voice so pure it silenced entire crowds. Her arms, however, were always hidden, her sleeves carefully arranged to conceal what lay beneath. The truth, unknown to the cheering public, was that many of these performers had not joined willingly. They had been taken, chosen for their unusual appearances, disabilities, or simply their isolation from anyone who would notice their disappearance. Orphans, immigrants, with no family, the forgotten and unseen. These were Vaneir's prey. Sheriff Josiah Cromwell had struck a quiet deal with Vaneir soon after his arrival, a payment of $50 a month, more than most men earned in two, to keep any troubling questions from being asked. Even the occasional report of a missing person during the circus's travels to nearby towns never raised suspicion. Then there was Dr. Heinrich Kellermann, supposed German physician who arrived 6 months after Vaneir, renting an office above the general store. He posed as a medical expert in human developmental disorders, but in truth, he had no medical degree. His real specialty was chemistry, specifically concocting drugs that kept victims docile, compliant, and unable to resist. Together, Vaneir, Cromwell, and Kellerman built a perfect crime machine. They scouted small towns, targeting the vulnerable. Kellerman would offer free treatments, dosing victims with a mix of laudanum and other opiates that knocked them unconscious. By the time they awoke, they were chained in the opera house's basement, with no memory of how they'd gotten there. But the real horror wasn't the kidnapping, it was the transformation. Vaneir broke his captives through a mix of psychological torment, physical abuse, and addiction. He didn't just make them perform. He erased who they had been, replacing their identities with the roles he had chosen for them. The first crack in Vaneir's monstrous empire came on the night of October 12, 1891. A young woman stumbled into the office of the Millerville Weekly Gazette, barely able to stand. Thomas Fairchild, the paper's editor, was working late when the pounding on his door shook him from his desk. Opening it, he found a girl in her early 20s, malnourished, barefoot, her eyes wild with terror. "They're still down there," she whispered, gripping his arm with startling strength. "In the dark. The chains are too heavy. They can't get out." Her name, she said after some hesitation, was Sarah Henley, maybe, from Lancaster. She wasn't sure. What she was sure of chilled Fairchild to the core. "They told me I was dead," she said. "They showed me papers that said I was dead." At first, Fairchild doubted her. The story was too strange, too horrifying. But the details she gave specific, unshakably, and the look in her eyes told him this was no wild delusion. Something unspeakable was happening beneath Millerville's old opera house. Sarah's words spilled out in jagged fragments, but the details were too sharp to ignore. She described the opera house basement with uncanny precisional ways, cell doors, even the cracked brickwork in the far western wall. Every architectural feature matched what Fairchild knew of the building. She named other captives' full names, physical descriptions, and personal histories too consistent to be hallucinations. And then came the detail that made Fairchild's blood run cold. "There's a ledger," she said, her voice steadying as if she'd been holding this truth inside for years. "Mr. Vaneir keeps it in his office. It has all our names, where we came from, how much we cost. He calls us his investments. Some of the entries go back years, Mr. Fairchild, years. This was no petty abuse. This was an industrial scale criminal machine running silently beneath the feet of an unsuspecting town for more than a decade." Fairchild's stomach knotted with a mix of horror and the sharp, dangerous thrill of a journalist staring down the biggest story of his life. But he would need proof, and getting that proof meant walking straight into the lion's den. Sarah's escape had been a fluke, a perfect storm of small mistakes. Her captor, Kellerman's young assistant Peter, had miscalculated her evening dose of laudanum instead of slipping into the usual drugged stupor. She'd been left lucid, clear-headed enough to notice that her shackles weren't properly secured. By the time Peter returned, Sarah was gone. She told Fairchild about the prison below, the opera house, a warren of narrow, windowless rooms, each fitted with a single chain bolted to the wall. The chain allowed just enough movement for the prisoner to lie down, but never enough to reach the door. Clever pulleys and locks meant only Vaneir or Kellerman could release the restraints. On one side of her cell was Jan the Bavarian Colossus, real name, Jan Briner. Once a dock worker in Philadelphia, he'd been lured away by the promise of steady pay. His towering frame and gentle mind made him perfect for the show. But years of sedation and abuse had reduced him to a childlike dependency on his captors. On the other side was Mary Catherine, the singing angel, real name Catherine Alley, born in Scranton with a rare birth defect that left her arms underdeveloped. Her voice had been her gift. 3 years earlier, she'd vanished after accepting an audition for what she believed was a legitimate theater company. She'd never been seen again till Sarah found herself chained beside her. The cruelty went beyond bars and chains. Vaneir and Kellerman attacked the captives' very sense of self. They were stripped of their real names, given new identities, and fed a constant diet of lies. Their families thought they were dead. They were forgotten. They were unwanted. Fake death certificates were filed in county offices, often with Sheriff Cromwell's signature quietly smoothing the paperwork through. Forged letters, supposedly from loved ones, were read aloud to them, expressing relief that their burden had been lifted. For the long-term prisoners, this psychological assault was more devastating than the physical abuse. Some began to doubt they'd ever existed outside the Cabinet of Wonders. Fairchild spent 3 days chasing Sarah's claims through county records. What he found froze his blood. In the last 5 years, dozens of deaths had been recorded for people with unusual physical features or disabilities, most from sudden, unexplained illnesses or accidents. Witness testimony was scarce, investigations laughably brief, and, disturbingly, the faces of these deceased bore uncanny resemblance to Vaneir's performers. The dates matched almost exactly with the circus's travel routes. Fairchild knew what he had to do. On October 16th, he walked straight into Sheriff Cromwell's cramped, tobacco-stained office in the town hall basement. The sheriff was cleaning his revolver when Fairchild entered slowly, deliberately, as though making a point. "I hear," Cromwell said without looking up, "you've been asking some interesting questions." Fairchild mentioned the suspicious death certificates. He didn't get far. Without warning, Cromwell swung the revolver up and smashed the butt across Fairchild's temple. The journalist crashed to the floor, blood streaming into his eye. The sheriff stood over him, gun aimed squarely at his head. "You're going to forget everything that girl told you," Cromwell said in a calm, almost friendly tone. "You're going to forget you ever saw her. And if I hear you've been spreading lies about upstanding citizens like Mr. Vaneir, well, accidents happen in mining towns. Men disappear all the time." Cromwell had just made a fatal mistake in Sarah's story in revealing his own role in the conspiracy. Fairchild staggered out of the office certain of two things. He was in mortal danger, and he was more determined than ever to bring Vaneir down. He couldn't trust the local law. State or federal authorities might tip Cromwell off before they could act. So Fairchild devised a dangerous solution. If he couldn't bring the law to the evidence, he would bring the evidence to the law and the public. The plan: infiltrate the Opera House basement, photograph the cells, document the captives, find a ledger. Sarah's knowledge of the routines and layout would be his guide. Timing would be everything. They had no idea they were already being watched. Kellerman, suspicious of Sarah's lucky escape, had begun quietly inventorying his supplies. On the evening of October 23rd, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. Several vials of chloroform and a quantity of photographic chemicals were missing, and he knew, instantly, what that meant. Someone was planning to expose them. Kellerman didn't waste a second. The moment he realized chemicals were missing, he went straight to Vaneir and Cromwell. Within the hour, the three men were seated in the Opera House office, speaking in low, deliberate voices, as they activated what they chillingly called their emergency protocol. The plan was brutally simple: erase everything, every ledger, every trace, and every captive. Fairchild and Sarah's infiltration, which they believed to be a secret, had already been anticipated. Kellerman's discovery had forced the conspirators to move faster. Rather than waiting to see what evidence might surface, they decided to eliminate the threat before it could breathe. On the night of October 24, 1891, Fairchild and Sarah crept toward the Opera House under a starless sky, completely unaware that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. From the outside, the building looked exactly as Sarah remembered it: dark, lifeless, and empty. Vaneir and his men usually spent their evenings at the Millerville Social Club, a place for the town's elite to drink, gamble, and trade favors behind closed doors. That absence had given Sarah her original chance to escape. Fairchild was counting on the same routine to keep them safe. They slipped through the basement window Sarah had left unlocked weeks earlier. Inside, the blackness was suffocating. The air reeked of human waste, sweat, and something else sweet, heavy, and oddly familiar. Fairchild couldn't place it yet. Using a shaded lantern to cut the darkness, they navigated the twisting warren of makeshift cells. The sight that greeted them was far worse than Sarah's desperate words had ever conveyed. The captives were skeletal, their bodies scarred with the unmistakable marks of systematic abuse and experimentation. Some lay half-conscious, pupils unfocused, trapped in a fog of heavy sedation. Yant the gentle giant sat, slumped against the wall. Massive wrists and ankles rubbed raw from years of steel biting into his flesh. His once mighty frame was wasted to bone, his vacant gaze flickering only slightly when Sarah whispered his name. Catherine Ollie, the singing angel, was worse still. The crystalline voice that had once filled packed tents was now a ragged rasp. Her throat bore the damage of being forced to sing while drugged, her focus slipping away after only seconds of lucidity. Fairchild's hands trembled as he began setting up his camera. Meanwhile, Sarah moved from cell to cell, crouching by each prisoner, offering hushed words of comfort they barely seemed to hear. In the far corner, what had once been the Opera House wine cellar, they stumbled on Kellerman's hidden laboratory. It was worse than any prison cell. Tables sagged under the weight of glass bottles, syringes, and surgical tools far too sharp, far too specialized to be used for mere sedation. Journals lay open, dense with German text, the margins dotted with English translations. The entries detailed behavioral modification, pain endurance thresholds, and what Kellerman clinically referred to as psychological reconstruction. But the most damning evidence sat not in the lab, but in Vaneir's private office. Behind a false panel in the old box office wall was the ledger. Sarah had spoken of and it was more horrifying than she imagined. 43 names, 8 years of acquisitions. Each entry listed the victim's real identity, place of origin, how they'd been taken, and the stage name assigned to them. Next to some names, one chilling word, discontinued. Fairchild understood immediately, meant dead. 17 were marked as active. The remaining gone. He photographed page after page, the flicker of the lantern casting long skeletal shadows over the paper. That's when it happened, a sound from the basement stairs that turned his blood to ice. Heavy boots, low voices, and then he recognized it, that sweet, cloying smell from earlier, chloroform pumped straight into the basement vents. By the time he realized what was happening, it was already too late. Sarah crumpled to the floor near the far wall. Fairchild's head spun, muscles weakening, vision tunneling. He grabbed a camera, stuffed the most crucial pages into his coat butt. The dark tide was rising too fast. The last thing he saw was Cornelius Vaneir descending the stairs, lantern in one hand, revolver in the other. Behind him came Sheriff Cromwell, Dr. Kellerman, and 2 thick-shouldered strangers with the unmistakable swagger of hired killers. As the world tilted into blackness, Fairchild knew he and Sarah were about to become just 2 more lines in that ledger under discontinued. When he woke, he was chained to the damp wall of a basement cell. The camera gone, the ledger pages gone. Sarah was in the next cell, still unconscious, pale as death. The hours that followed were a living nightmare. Vaneir, Kellerman, and Cromwell interrogated him in turns. Kellerman's methods were scientific agonies, designed to leave no permanent marks. Cromwell favored the classic leather straps, ice water near drownings, whispered threats about Sarah's fate. But Vaneir was different, calm, almost amused. He spoke to Fairchild like an art dealer admiring a new acquisition. "You have presence, Thomas," he mused. "Intelligent eyes, a face that tells a story. With the right adjustments, you could be compelling on stage. I see it now, the scholar of sorrows, a man of letters driven mad by forbidden knowledge. The audience would adore you. The casual tone was somehow worse than the beatings. It revealed the truth. To Vaneir, people weren't people, they were inventory. Even through the pain, Fairchild listened. Every word told him more about the scope of this operation. Vaneir had contacts in at least 6 states, a web of corrupt sheriffs, doctors, and businessmen. And the Cabinet of Wonders was only one of his ventures. Vaneir's empire wasn't limited to the spectacle of the Cabinet of Wonders. Behind closed doors, he ran private exhibitions, exclusive performances, for the wealthy who paid obscene sums for intimate horrors. These secret shows often veered into the sexual and the sadistic, drawing from the darkest appetites of his elite clientele. Here lay his real fortune. The moment Fairchild's investigation began to stir trouble, Vaneir initiated the full purge. The emergency protocol wasn't just about silencing witnesses, it was about erasing Millerville itself from the map of his operations. A relocation to Ohio was already in motion, where a corrupt asylum director had agreed to hide his activities under the facade of medical care. The plan was merciless: kill every captive, burn every record, and arrange accidental deaths for anyone who could connect him to the horrors, including Fairchild, Sarah. Even townsfolk who'd asked one question too many, and Peter's anxious young assistant was on that list too. But Vaneir's fatal miscalculation was assuming Fairchild worked alone. He didn't know about Margaret Dalton, a relentless investigative journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and one of Fairchild's oldest allies. For months, Fairchild had been sending her letters, at first casual updates, then veiled warnings. In his last letter, mailed just 2 days before Sarah's escape, he'd laid everything bare, telling her to alert federal authorities if she heard nothing in 10 days. That deadline was almost up. Dalton had already begun contacting the Treasury Department and the new Bureau of Investigation. More importantly, she'd sent copies of Fairchild's letters to other major papers, meaning if she went down, the story wouldn't. On October 28th, a telegram arrived at the Millerville Telegraph Office, addressed to Sheriff Cromwell, but meant for Fairchild's eyes. Sheriff Cromwell, conducting research for article on traveling entertainments. Require interview with Thomas Fairchild and Cornelius Vaneir, federal authorities interested in regional business practices. Arriving November 1st with documentation team. Please arrange meetings. M. Dalton, Philadelphia Inquirer, Henry Walsh. The nosy telegraph operator carried it straight to Cromwell, but not before mentioning it to the wrong people, including the barkeep at the social club, who passed it to Vaneir. That same night, panic took hold. The emergency protocol had been built for local threats. Federal investigators, national press, impossible to contain. Dalton's mention of a documentation team was a loaded gun proof. She might already have evidence in hand. In his fear, Vaneir made the decision that would destroy him. The killings would happen now. The opera house would burn before dawn. Every body reduced to ash. Every chain and ledger page consumed. And then, with what wealth he could grab, he would vanish. The night of October 29th began with Kellerman preparing lethal doses morphine and strychnine, enough to quietly end 17 lives. Once dead, the captives would be doused in kerosene and burned with the building. But Peter finally broke. Weeks of guilt had eaten him alive, and the thought of standing by while 17 people were slaughtered was more than he could bear. He bolted from the opera house straight to the home of Reverend Samuel Brooks, Millerville's unshakable Methodist pastor, one of the few untouched by Vaneir's money. At first, Brooks thought Peter was raving, but as the young man described the basement in chilling detail and named people who were supposed to be long dead, the truth began to set in. Together, they devised a desperate 2-pronged plan. Brooks would wire urgent messages to the governor and Pennsylvania State Police, while Peter went back to delay the killings. Time was the enemy. Kellerman had already begun the first stage of his poisoning a sedative that would lay the groundwork for fatal heart failure. Peter had to think fast. He told Kellerman that Cromwell wanted to question the captives one last time before their disposal, stalling the process and buying precious hours for the Reverend's telegrams to reach Harrisburg. Meanwhile, in his damp basement cell, Fairchild was working on his own escape. Weak from chloroform and beatings, he'd spotted a flaw in his shackles. The anchor bolt was set into crumbling masonry. Every chance he got, he applied leverage, twisting and grinding until, at last, the bolt gave way. By sheer coincidence, Fate Fairchild broke free at the exact moment Peter's delaying tactics were playing out upstairs, and the first wave of state police officers were beginning their ride toward Millerville. But escape was only the beginning. The basement was still guarded, and Fairchild's strength was nearly gone. Still, he knew the opera house well enough from his earlier infiltration to slip through the maze toward the other captives. What Fairchild saw, as he began freeing the captives, was a brutal testament to human endurance and to the catastrophic damage that years of psychological and physical abuse can inflict. Some prisoners were so drugged or broken that they stared blankly, unable to process what was happening. Others, trapped for so long, were convinced escape would mean worse punishment. Sarah, shaking, gaunt, but unshaken in Wilby, came the key to unlocking their hope. Her earlier escape had made her a figure of credibility. She whispered to each captive by name, reminding them of who they were, countering years of Kellerman's lies with truths only she could deliver. But their bodies told the rest of the story. Yon, the gentle giant, was barely able to stand, his once mighty frame reduced to skin over bone. Catherine O'Malley's breathing came in ragged gasps, her chest rattling from a chronic illness left untreated. Others had untreated fractures, infected wounds, injuries Kellerman had cultivated to keep them compliant. Above them, the building was coming alive, boots pounding, furniture scraping, voices barking, orders. Vaneir's emergency protocol was in motion. The crisis erupted when Kellerman himself descended, irritated by Peter's unexplained delays. The moment he saw Fairchild's empty shackles and the freed captives, his shout was the signal. Alarm. Seconds later, Vaneir stormed in, revolver drawn, Cromwell at his side. Flanked by hired thugs, in the cramped, foul-smelling corridors, chaos exploded. The captives were trapped between their tormentors and their would-be rescuers. Vaneir's rage zeroed in on Fairchild more than a threat now. The journalist was a personal insult that demanded crushing. That obsession became his mistake. While Vaneir lunged for Fairchild, Sarah and the more able captives scrambled toward the basement stairs. Where Peter stood watch, at the top of the stairs, came salvation. Reverend Brooks, not waiting for backup, had come himself, bringing with him 3 Pennsylvania State police officers who'd arrived hours earlier than expected, thanks to a lucky rail connection. Cromwell froze. His badge meant nothing to the state officers, already briefed on his corruption. As survivors stumbled into the open, the confusion broke Vaneir's control of the building. Cornered, Vaneir and Kellerman retreated to his office, barricading themselves inside. Their plan was simple: burn every document, then shoot their way out. But Fairchild's earlier photographs had already preserved the worst evidence, and those images were hidden far from the opera house. Outside the barricade, history was unfolding. 17 people, legally declared dead, were alive, shaking, but breathing. State officials documented their faces, took their statements, and began arranging medical care. Then, the breakthrough came. Jan Brinner, the shattered giant, saw Kellerman's face through the office window. Something inside him reignited. With a roar that shook the walls, he tore into the barricade, splintering heavy furniture like kindling. In minutes, the police had a clear path inside. Kellerman collapsed without resistance, broken in spirit. Vaneir, however, calmly fed page after page into a wastebasket fire. "Gentlemen," he said, eyes cold, "you're too late. The crimes died with these papers." But he was wrong. Fairchild and Sarah's photographs, survivor testimony, and Peter's insider knowledge were already enough to dismantle everything. Cromwell's arrest was almost pitiful. He folded instantly, bargaining for leniency by naming names in Vaneir's network. The most haunting moment came not from violence, but from a voice Catherine, Ali's, her throat damaged, her song barely more than a rasp. She began a hymn her mother had taught her. One by one, the survivors joined in. It was thin, cracked, but human. In that cold, rotting building, their song was Defiance. By dawn on October 30th, 1891. The scale of the horror was clear. The 17 freed were only a fraction of Vaneir's victims. 26 others in the ledger's discontinued column would never see justice. The trials transfixed the nation. For the first time, organized human trafficking was prosecuted in American courts on such a scale. The charges were staggering: 43 counts of kidnapping, 17 of unlawful imprisonment, 26 of murder. Cornelius Vaneir was sentenced to death. His execution on March 15, 1893, drew crowds and protesters alike, but little sympathy. Kellerman, spared the noose for his cooperation, was given life in prison, his confessions helping dismantle accomplice networks in 6 states. Would never forget what was uncovered in the basement of the Opera House. Neither would the rest of America. Perhaps, most importantly, Kellerman's meticulously kept medical notes gave investigators the full scope of the psychological and physical torment inflicted on the captives, allowing doctors to finally begin the long process of real treatment and healing. Sheriff Josiah Cromwell's cooperation bought him a reduced sentence. 20 years, but he would serve only 7 before dying of a heart attack in 1899. His testimony ripped open the rotten underbelly of Western Pennsylvania politics, leading to the removal of 3 judges, 2 county commissioners, and dozens of minor officials who had looked the other way. The 17 survivors met wildly different fates. Sarah Henley, against all odds, rebuilt her life with the support of family and community. She became a fierce advocate for trafficking victims, working alongside law enforcement to expose other hidden operations. Jan Breener's recovery was partial. The years of manipulation had left scars no doctor could heal. He could never fully articulate his ordeal, yet he lived peacefully, working as a handyman and gardener within his Philadelphia church community, until his death in 1923. Catherine O'Malley's voice never regained its former brilliance, but her spirit endured. Returning to her family in Scranton, she married a merchant who had believed her dead but never stopped waiting. She lived quietly, rarely speaking of her years in captivity, though she kept in touch with other survivors until her passing in 1934. Thomas Fairchild's fearless reporting cemented his place among America's top investigative journalists. Moving to New York, he covered corruption, human trafficking, and abuse of power, but never forgot Millerville or the silenced voices he had helped restore. Margaret Dalton's role made history, becoming the Philadelphia Inquirer's first female investigative correspondent. She and Fairchild worked side by side on cases that brought down several criminal syndicates in the years that followed. The Millerville Opera House was demolished in 1892. 4 decades. The land sat empty until 1934, when the city planted a memorial garden on the site. A plaque bore the names of the 17 who survived, and the 26 discontinued, whose stories ended in the dark. But the true legacy of the Vandermeer case was its ripple effect. It forced law enforcement to face a grim truth. Crimes that crossed county and state lines required real cooperation between local, state, and federal agencies. It also exposed how easily marginalized people, immigrants, orphans, the disabled could be erased from society. Advocacy groups were born from the outrage. Laws were passed to regulate traveling entertainments, and new requirements ensured performers carried proof of voluntary participation. Inspections became mandatory, yet the shadows remained. Cromwell's testimony hinted at a far larger network stretching across the eastern United States. Many of Vaneir's accomplices were never caught slipping away under new names, perhaps continuing their work in other towns. Worse still, some of the discontinued in his ledger had not been killed. They had been sold. Most were never found, and perhaps the most chilling truth: the Cabinet of Wonders had thrived not in secret darkness, but in plain sight, protected by greed, prejudice, and the public's appetite for dehumanizing entertainment. False death certificates, bribed officials, audiences who never asked where the wonders came from. All of it had allowed the nightmare to grow. In the end, the Millerville case stands as both a testament to human resilience and a dire warning of what happens when power, greed, and indifference unite without accountability. The 17 freed souls had their names restored, their death certificates voided, and their voices recorded for history. But how many others remained lost in the shadows? Because history's worst monsters have never been mythical, they have always been human. What about you? Do you believe everything about this case was uncovered? Or do you think more victims remain hidden in America's forgotten corners? If you found this story chilling and want more tales like it, subscribe, hit the bell, and share with someone who loves a mystery that stays with you long after it's told.